Welcome to the Syndicate from the Business of Hockey and the Goal with your hosts Richard York and Les Kowalski. Sit down, have a cigar and scotch, listen to some good music, and we'll talk hockey and business. Let's start this episode. Welcome to the Syndicate. In this episode, we're going to start talking about the youth movement. And I know that you've got some theories with the COVID-19 and with the NHL. What are your thoughts on this idea, what they're planning to do with, instead of having neutral sites, they want to have 4 arenas, one of them being in Edmonton?
Well, I don't know. I think the idea with putting it in Edmonton is because they have hotels and stuff right in the new arena and everything, right? There's a certain payoff with that where they don't have to travel outside of where they're playing. They can all be in-house.
Well, for security purposes, everything is attached through that concourse. So absolutely, the new hotel would be able to support the teams there.
There's a lot of things that have to be dealt with, obviously, before we get any kind of confirmation as to what the NHL is going to do. The border being locked up is obviously one of them.
Well, that creates a logistical problem until that border gets unsealed.
Definitely. The NHL as a whole hasn't decided the format or direction or anything that is going to happen this year. There's been a lot of theories. By the time this episode airs, there might be some concrete decisions. As of right now of this recording, nothing has been put into stone yet. There's lots of theories about all 31 teams playing in one location, and then, as you mentioned, in 4 locations. And I think it all revolves around empty arenas, either which way we look at it. But there's a lot that goes into how do you format the rest of the season, or do you at all? Because there's a couple of bubble teams that really would want an extra shot to make the cut for the playoffs. Not every team played the same amount of games. You can see a disadvantage for some teams. Certainly, it's how do you make this fair for everybody? So there's a lot of things to work out, voting, a lot of structure, decisions that have to be made before we have any idea what this season is going to look like.
Well, this episode is going to be an interesting topic. We're going to be talking about the youth movement in hockey. What is your explanation the youth movement in hockey is?
Well, when we talk about the youth movement in hockey, it has to do with the peak performance range of the average hockey player. For a long time, it was 27 to 29 years old was the fairly average. You know, every player peaks differently at different points, but we're just talking a big scale, average scale, that usually 27 to 29 was defined as their peak performance years. So everything up to the age of 27 was you were building towards that peak performance. And then after 29, you were kind of cascading down, give or take. There's a certain stereotype when you hit 30 years old, you're like, how far are you going to drop off the other side? The same can't be said for superstar players like Ovechkin and Crosby and stuff like that. Those guys are generational talents, just like McDavid is. So they're kind of outside the rules. They like the exception for the averages. So when we talk about the youth movement in hockey, we're not really talking about those guys who come in and dominate the league at 18 years old. We're talking the average player. Defensemen take more time to develop and to mature. So usually their peak range is a few years later than forwards. But on average, they say 27 to 29 was the average peak years. In this day and age, you're probably looking at more 23 to 25, somewhere in there. You know, even as defensemen, you get young defensemen that are coming in and they know the game better. They perform in the game better. Like Drew Doughty was young stud and stuff like that. Like he surprised everybody. Nobody thought he was. I think he went to the Olympics as a 22-year-old. He played for Team Canada at the Olympics and he kicked butt, and he performed well. So what we wanted to talk about was what's different. What's different in the league now as opposed to, we'll say, about 20 years ago? What's the difference in the youth movement? And for all those people who are going to immediately say conditioning, I think you're wrong. Conditioning has always been an element in the sport. Absolutely, training methods and conditioning methods have improved as technology has improved over the last 20 years. But these guys are paid to be professional athletes, and you've always had to have that physical element. Even 20 years ago, you had to be in really good shape to be a professional hockey player. In this day and age, the bar is still high, but I don't think there's a big difference between conditioning levels 20 years ago as they are today. You got players on, we just talked about the Calgary Flames. You got Mark Giordano, who leads his team in conditioning. beginning of training camp every year. He's in the top 3 every year, and he's 36 years old. So as far as peak conditioning changes throughout your career and throughout, your peak years. So I don't think that plays a lot into the youth movement in this day and age, and that's what we're going to talk a lot about. So to define what the youth movement is in NHL hockey, it is the peak years of performance of a hockey player becoming 3 or 4 years earlier than it was 20 years ago. So how we're going to define this is, first I'd like to start with a comment from a man named Abraham Weiner. He's involved in baseball analytics, and he made a quote that said, "Better nutrition and training don't seem to have lengthened the careers of baseball players," supporting the old school quote that 90% of baseball is mental and 10% is physical. Now, when you look at hockey, a lot more than 10% is physical. You have to be in peak condition, right? But on the grandest of scales in professional sports, there's a huge mental element to it that we've been talking about. When you're looking at hockey, just throwing a number out there, you're probably looking at more closer to 50-50, maybe 60-40, but there's a huge mental element to this game. Bottom 6 forwards are usually in just the same kind of condition as top 6 forwards. So what's the difference, right? What's the difference between a bottom 6 forward and a top 6 forward if both of them are running the same conditioning stints, the same workouts, the same diets? There's got to be a difference. So where is it? It would be on that mental side of the game, right?
You had a theory that you brought up at the end of the last Hashmarks episode. Maybe you can get into that a little bit on what your theory is.
My theory is I gave you guys a little nugget of what we wanted to talk about here. The biggest difference between kids of today and kids of 20 years ago, and every parent and every teacher and every professor, everybody who deals with kids in this day and age can certainly vote towards technology and video games. So it's a digital application in today's world. Video games are huge. And to start off this bunny trail down the video games, first and foremost, I would like to clarify that just because you have a high score in Halo doesn't mean you're qualified to be a professional sports athlete. Okay, so don't get too excited if you're like number 1 on the high charts board. What we're talking about here has to do with the mental aspect of what those video games and digital applications do to your brain growing up. You've certainly done your research into what that actually is and what it breaks down to, the actual science behind it. So why don't you kick her off?
What we need to do is get into more of the science behind video games. So one of the things that I want to do is get into science papers that have been written with respect to video games. There's one here in particular that was issued in May of 2019 called Positive Effects of Video Game Use on Visuospatial Competencies, the Impact of Visualization Style in Pre-Adolescence and Adolescence. What I wanted to do is actually get into just a couple of the different aspects that have to do with the visuospatial competency. What it says here, several subdomains in visuospatial competencies, spatial perception, mental rotation, spatial visualization, and spatiotemporal ability, they can be defined as follows. Spatial perception is the ability to correctly assess and perceive spatial relationships. Mental rotation is the ability to mentally rotate either 2D or 3D spatial objects to see how they would look from a different angle or perspective. Spatial visualization is the ability to perform multiple mental manipulations of spatial information in order to reach a different configuration of the visual stimulus. And spatiotemporal ability is the ability to make accurate judgments regarding the timing and the movement of objects through space. And what it says here is that visuospatial competencies are a domain that is susceptible to improvement via formal, example, school-specific exercise, and informal training, for example, performing day-to-day tasks like driving. As children progress in their development, these skills are very important for understanding and mastering material in the physical sciences, engineering, architecture, medicine. In fact, visuospatial skills are central in many everyday tasks, including navigating through 2 and 3D maps, using tools, operating machineries, driving cars, and are closely related to academic achievement in STEM, which is defined as science, technology, engineering, and mathematics disciplines. In this same paper, it talks about how habits in video game use and not only specific training are strongly correlated with better visuospatial competencies. In fact, children who habitually use video games, especially action ones, show better performance in visual memory tasks independent of gender. It also talks about how the positive effects extend to adulthood and a large array of action games, non-action games, puzzles, and strategic games on multiple devices, which include handheld and home-based, that transfer a cognitive enhancement, which is more likely to take place when game activities are closely matched with real-world tasks. Regarding the positive effects of gaming, it is argued that anyone who's playing video games may not only enhance cognitive and attentive performance, but also to a greater extent facilitate the learning of new tasks via flexible interaction with a highly motivating environment, such as the one in action video games. And it talks about the different domains. It talks about the focus on attention of target. One of the things that I found really fascinating, it says effects of action video games can be found in different domains of visuospatial competencies. Selective attention in space, for example, the ability to focus attention on a target and ignoring distracting information. Selecting attention in time, for example, the ability to select relative information over time, and the selective attention to objects, for example, the ability to track many independent moving objects. So this is the foundation by which these papers are rooted in, and it breaks it down into these different categories. Several papers that I'm going to bring up, it talks about ignoring distracting information. One of the things that I found really intriguing, when you're playing video games and it's the action-based type video games, your eyes and your mind are able to remove distracting information at high speed of whatever that you're actually doing. And I see how that has the ability to translate into hockey, because hockey as a sport, over the last 20 years, there's a very defined focus to take the game and focus it very much on skill and speed. This has been coming up time and time again.
When it comes to hockey, there's certainly a pace difference between now and 20 years ago. So any of those true hockey fans, if you look back 20 years ago, the game was more physical, it was more heavy, it was more violent. And today it is really fast. And there's a lot of skill. Not only does that have to do with the physical attributes of the athletes coming up and their conditioning regimens being changed to mold itself to the game of today, but they have to make quicker decisions. You gave there about the paper and whatnot has to do with that, is that you focus in more directly on what you need to focus in on. And certainly in hockey, you have multiple targets on the ice. You have your own players, you have the opposing players, you have goalies, whatever, right? So the ability to focus on the movements of several objects and tune out the ones you don't need to be focused on is certainly a mental hurdle that these hockey players, sometimes it takes years and years for them to develop that, right? So the fact that these kids can potentially shortcut some of that brain activity and that brain training by doing video game applications, something of the sort, is certainly giving them a head start into the league. And that's only one small feature of the youth movement and the video game application that you want to talk about. So let's hear another paper.
This has been part 1 of The Syndicate from the Business of Hockey and the Goal. Next week, we'll be posting part 2. Thanks for listening to The Syndicate from the Business of Hockey and the Goal. Till next week. Thanks for listening to The Syndicate from the Business of Hockey and the Goal, produced by the Power Roadmap Podcast. Until next time.
My body shakes, nowhere to run. When we're alone